you to the host of that panel, Brandon Knott.
Hi,
hey,
Brian.
Brandon.
Thanks very much. Good seeing you too. Appreciate having us on today.
Fantastic. Brandon, I'll leave it over to you. Look forward to hearing what I'm sure will be a fantastic panel discussion.
Perfect. Thank you. I'd like to bring my guests on immediately to join the fun here. Today, we have Kevin Crone joining us from PwC. As well, we have Taylor Bingo Heron joining us from the U.S. Air Force. Guys, welcome.
Thanks, Brandon.
Thanks, Brandon. Good to be here.
All right, so here's how I'd like to start off, and I want to jump right into it. First is just a real brief introduction to set the tone for the types of things we're going to talk about. Let's do some quick intros and then jump into some questions. So to set the stage, right, what we're hearing from companies right now and what we're seeing from white papers like the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report, as well as a recent IDC paper that came out, when we look at what happened during the pandemic from a digital transformation sense, everybody accelerated, right? Many companies achieved their entire year roadmap in a matter of months. And coming out of that experience, nobody is looking at the future saying, okay, let's go back to pre-pandemic pace, right? We're not going to slow down. In fact, most research is pointing to the fact that we're going to keep accelerating. This pace that we've experienced over the last year will at least do that in 2021, if not more. So for discussion, I think one, it's safe to say RPA is here. It's proved itself. It's not really up for debate. The questions that are coming through from customers and from the industry now is, how do we keep moving that forward, whether it's citizen development, whether it's more advanced capabilities like document understanding and working with unstructured data, changing, evolving the human experience into more complex interfaces like apps and more engaging, enriching human to robot connectivity. So for this conversation, we're really going to focus on this evolving technology and as well, what's the human impact on all of this? Because the more that we talk about robots, ironically, the more and more this story becomes a human story about how we are engaging with that. So having said that, I'd love to get some introductions. Kevin, can you give us a little bit of background and as well help frame your experience in the context of this constantly evolving world that we're in?
Sure, Brandon, happy to. So just as a quick introduction, Kevin Crone, I'm a partner with PwC in their products and technology practice. I lead a number of efforts around intelligent automation and upskilling and have been focused both on products and services that we provide in this space. Coming at this discussion probably from two different perspectives. One, PwC has been on its own digital transformation and how we operate internally as a company and have played a role as an advisor in helping to guide that. And we've, as we looked at our business, we think, a lot of what Brandon's talking about in terms of both probably the pre-pandemic disruption that we saw coming and then how that's been accelerated and built upon during that, and can hopefully share some experiences from that. The second is as a client-serving professional, we're dealing with our clients every day on advising these issues. And I think as we look across different industries, companies at different maturity levels, we're learning all sorts of interesting things around what, A, what are some of the challenges, B, what are some of the outcomes that companies are going for, and see, what are really the blockers in getting there, and looking at some of the different aspects from a people aspect, from an operating model aspect, from a risk aspect, and so forth. So hopefully I can share some perspectives today and make this an engaging discussion for everyone. I think you're on mute, Brandon.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Bingo, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. So like Kevin, basically work to kind of handle our digital upskilling for our Air Force. So I'm an action officer, basically work for the Vice Chief of Staff. So basically our number 2 in the Air Force. Across a range of initiatives, we got a lot. So 700,000 people, We've got about 90 bases, which are basically mini cities. So we do everything from, you know, launching missiles to planes to, like, you have cooks and you have finance and you have medicine and all that. So it's a really big portfolio for us. So there's a lot of things we try and tackle, but I think the common denominator in all those is data. I mean, you come down to moving at speed in today's you know, kind of environment, it's hard to do any of that without getting your data right. And RPA is obviously a huge piece of that. So we've been really, really passionate about RPA. We are doing that, as you would imagine, in an industry our size, in many different ways. A lot of that is enterprise level stuff, but what I'm most excited about is honestly the citizen developer aspect of that, because it allows us to tap into a whole different level of our ecosystem. So I'm excited to kind of expand on that as we go, and just excited to talk. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. And a quick introduction for myself. Brandon Nato was a customer before I was an employee. I ran operations for a mortgage company and implemented UiPath, so I got to saw firsthand the benefits, but also the challenges at that time of building out a practice. And it's safe to say I fell in love with the technology and wanted to come to work for UiPath full time and help work with other customers and partners and that ecosystem to help everybody be successful. All right, so let's jump right in. And Bingo, I want to continue a couple comments from your update there. You know, traditionally when we think about the private sector, the public sector, there's a stigma of moving slower than say the private sector. But in your case, and what's happening in the Air Force right now, you've turned that on its head. I mean, your example, your implementation is one of the best around. How are you doing that, and what is your forward outlook?
Yeah, you bet. We steal lessons learned from other really good industries. That's what we do. Now, I would say for us, a couple key components, and we are heavily investing. So like I said, we've got a lot of individual efforts out there, but we also, you know, threw a couple million at trying to, you know, spark the ecosystem a little bit last year, and are actively looking at how to scale that now. I think key for us was senior leader buy-in. So what we found is that this isn't something that's easy to do just completely grassroots. I mean, you can do a little bit of that, but certainly building the ecosystem that supports that, particularly for an enterprise level kind of effort, is really important. Specifically for us, because we'll have single programs that will touch each of those 90 bases. So as you enterprise level support. So for us, you know, we basically got senior level or senior leader level endorsement to kind of push really hard because they see the value. And then really, we effectively self-funded the ability to get people over that initial learning curve, because for a lot of RPA, we're a pretty digitally savvy force. I think we pride ourselves on that. But for anybody, and I talk to a lot of folks, you know, they think they got to get in there and get in Python and go crazy and start coding out. It just, that barrier to entry seems a little scary. For citizen developer stuff, it's not blatantly easy. There's some stuff you have to do, but it's nothing people can't overcome. And so what we did was try to lower those barriers to entry as much as we could to allow people to jump in the ecosystem, help solve their problems. And by doing that, we found incredible ROI. And yeah, I'm happy to dive into that a little bit if you want.
Excellent. We will get there, but you started talking about barriers to entry and how our customers, and in this case, you getting involved. Kevin, question for you, both internally, you've seen those barriers to entry, as well you help your customers, your clientele, overcome those barriers to entry. How can companies who haven't taken that leap yet start to rationalize the opportunity and weigh that cost benefit?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I think if we rewind the clock back a couple of years ago, and I mean, attending conferences like this, and you talk about the emergence of RPA, often the discussion would revolve around something to the extent of, hey, in order to get started and get organized, you need to form a center of excellence. That center of excellence will be the people that you're going to train up and upskill on this. They're going to go around the organization, division, company, find opportunities, build opportunities, deploy opportunities. And that was called the generation one model. I think as we looked at our clients with that model, kind of saw what worked and didn't work, you know, there were a couple of clear findings. One, the technology that we're talking about, whether it's RPA or document understanding or others, generally worked. And I think there wasn't an issue with it just doesn't fit into the enterprise environment. The issues tended to be with issues of scale, velocity, speed, and kind of showed it, we can't find enough opportunities, or we can't find enough high value opportunities, or the lower value opportunities are too expensive to automate in the way we're set up. And the pace we're going, it's going to take us 100 years to really kind of make any type of material impact. And so I think the barrier to jump over, or sorry, the outcome to jump over is how can you actually move quicker. But then I think we saw kind of a second trend behind that. I think a lot of the early stage kind of work was focused purely from a cost takeout perspective, and really it was about efficiency. How many hours can I save? And that was kind of like the standard metric as we looked at most of our clients. And I think if you look forward and kind of combine those two things together, you're kind of presenting a perfect opportunity for the emergence of the citizen-led model. One is you can't do this top-down centrally and move quick enough. And so you really do have to think about how do you actually engage your workforce. And when I say workforce, talking about kind of your organization's kind of outside of traditional IT technology construct. How do you get them productive with the technology? And productive could mean two different things. One could mean the ability to use the technology. If someone builds a bot or another digital asset, I can actually run that. Some of it may be the ability to create ideas for a bot, or with the right amount of upskilling to actually code and build a bot. And I think what we saw with that was a couple of major benefits. One, the ability to actually get some immediate scale and velocity, both on kind of priming the pump for idea generation, but also giving a cheap and inexpensive way to go after the lower value kind of task level opportunities that are out there. And that was kind of the immediate benefit. But I think what we're seeing as and kind of the great thing about this is the long-term vision. And I think it's the barrier to your question, Brandon, about the barrier to get over. By starting to think about this as an upskilling journey for your employees, and RPA may be one of many technologies you're training employees on. You're helping to redefine what roles could look like in the future. What does a digital controller look like? What does a digital FP&A analyst? What does a digital client service analyst look like? And the benefits that you're going to get down the road are not going to be purely cost. It's going to be improved customer experience, improved employee experience, better analytics and insights, potential revenue increase. Like there's a bunch of other benefits that are, with the right amount of upskilling. I think the mindset shift is really to think about, it's not just a long-term investment. Like if I do this now, I get some immediate pickup on my efficiency agenda, and I can get some long-term benefit out of that. And I think when we see our clients and even some of our internal stakeholders, kind of flip their brain and their mind shift to that, it's pretty powerful.
Indeed.
I'd like to pile on that if I can. Yeah, so I think Kevin's piece on how you measure ROI there, it's not just financial, I think is really important. I do candidly think for large organizations though, that financial ROI, it helps justify the buy for RPA, but it's a pretty easy one once you get there. So small example for us, and this is all ground up, at an airman level, no airman joins the Air Force to go move data between spreadsheets, right? I mean, I don't think anyone does in most industries. Maybe some people do, we don't. But for a lot of us, that's candidly what you spend a lot of your time doing, right? And so when you're logging your 12th or 13th or 14th hour in a day, and it's 12th or 13th or 14th hour, doing what you're passionate about and what you came in to serve to go do, and this is true probably in the industry, the problem from a leadership side is telling people to quit and tell them, please go home and sleep, right? Because they want to continue to be passionate about what they're doing. That flips when it's, you're just going to manually move data around and just work through mechanical processes that isn't what your passion is. So for us, that retention piece, we don't have a retention challenge because candidly COVID's helping everybody out right now, I think, from business side, but from a retention perspective. But there's certainly an organizational buy-in. We found people get incredibly passionate about doing their job when they get an opportunity to actually do their job and not spend their days just moving data. So we had just one example to talk about the different kinds of ROI. So In the Air Force, we move every 2 to 3 years, so it's part of what we do. That process, we're moving, thousands of people every month, so it's a big machine that makes that happen. And so for every person that gets moved and gets basically reassigned to another location, there's a big process behind it. And I used to run that process for some of our guys. That is literally lock yourself in a room for days and turn off the phones and mechanically move stuff between places. And every hour you invest doing that is basically an hour you don't invest learning about the human side of HR, right? So think about what is the best placement for a person, where should they go, what's mattered, what's going on with their family, all those good things that ought to go into a really good HR strategy. Kind of get eaten up by the bandwidth consuming pieces of mechanically moving somebody. So in our case, we put, I think it was like 30 or 40,000. It wasn't crazy money. I think we already reaped, I think we're at 6 million ROI in just pure labor, savings. But again, it's really the ability to reinvest that time to make deliberate placement moves. We accelerated our ability to get people on what we call on orders, basically tell them where they're going to go. I think by good 3 to 4 months. So what that means at a human level is that 3 to 4 months earlier, my wife now knows that we're going to go to Seattle. We're not going to go to Texas, right? Or she can start figuring out where my kid's going to go to school, right? Or we can start doing the job hunt thing and all those things that go into it, right? So the ROI goes well beyond the money. The money's an easy one, and candidly, it's there. But I would argue the ROI for organizations is much, much bigger.
That's a really good point. And again, the more that we dig into this, this is a human story. This is a people story. But technology and ROI and these things are kind of like you mentioned earlier. They're the logistical part of this story. Bingo, something else that I've heard you talk about before is the amount of outcomes that are expected to be generated from your team, but yet you're not expected to grow your workforce, the airmen, proportionally. Can you talk to the difference between expectation and allocation there, and how does RPA come into play?
Yeah, you bet. So the short of it is, our entire defense apparatus, not just the Air Force, the entire national security apparatus really has a lot of work to do to get prepared for peer competition. We're walking into an era that is going to really challenge us in ways that we haven't been challenged before. And candidly, the force that we have today is not the force that's going to win tomorrow. And I like liberty, put on the uniform for a reason. We like to continue to defend the nation, right? So it's an all of nation thing. But the candid reality is there's a lot of work we have to do. But we can't also at the same time just stand down all the current operations we're doing, right? So you require us and you need us, and we need to be able to defend the nation today and prepare for tomorrow. And so it's kind of like owning a house and then building a house, but you have enough money for one house. So what do you do? So both from a personnel perspective and then just more broadly financial, we don't anticipate massively increased budgets over the next decade or whatnot. And candidly, I don't know that we should be able to expect those, but we're in a boat where we have to be smart about how we do things, right? And so for each of those 700,000 airmen, I need them thinking hard about how to create the future that we need to fight and win, and they can't do that if they're bogged down in current day processes. And so, I've ran a lot of units, but just one unit I ran most recently, similar thing. We had a stated capacity we had to meet that took up every bit of every airman's time I had. I deliberately stepped down the capacity I delivered to take a chunk of them to go birth the future. And that's a hard call as a leader to do because today's demands don't stop. So the only way I could get there, candidly, is it wasn't by magically snap my fingers and having 20,000 more people. It was figuring out how to make the people I have more efficient and giving them the bandwidth back. And so for me, that was really my passion. Why I jumped into RPA was really I just want to give the time back to the airmen. It's the most valuable thing we can give them, and it's what we need to give them to allow them to go build the future.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to pivot on that a little bit. And Kevin, if we look at that World Economic Forum paper, it looked a lot at 2025. That was kind of the benchmark. It said, what's going to happen between now and then? How are the skill sets of today going to shift as we approach 2025? And one of the findings was critical thinking and analysis, problem solving, self-management. These are the skill sets that are going to be top, at the top of the skill set food chain, if you will. Automation, we know, can free people up to be that, but now we have a gap. What do you do in order to shift from today, the data entry and those rote tasks from today, to actually being able to take advantage and develop those skills?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple of thoughts embedded in your question, Brandon. So I think as we're looking at clients that are trying to crack this problem, I think there are two different challenges to overcome. This is probably going a little bit back to my previous comments. I think one challenge is, what's the journey look like to actually get there, and how can you actually use that journey as a weapon, right? How can you use that as a way that'll actually force the upskilling? But then there's also a change management exercise of like, what's the outcome actually look like, and what does your future employee look like? I think it's not a, I think the World Economic Forum study was kind of stating something that I think most people would somewhat accept, that, future jobs are going to look much different than they do today in the way of kind of moving from a transaction processing oriented job into something that's more analytics driven, right? I spent a lot of time in the financial services industry. I think there's been a mentality, if you look at financial services employees in a bank that work within an operations or finance construct, their career development path has been brought up by transaction processing. You kind of start at a junior level doing something that's more transaction processing heavy. You eventually move into managing people doing that. You learn the businesses you're doing that, and that's how you kind of grow into a senior management role. That, as automation takes place, that's going to somewhat go, by the wayside, right? And really the people are going to win in the future in terms of moving up the chain are going to be individuals that build that analytics mindset. But then the question is, how do you, it's a chicken and egg thing, how do you actually build that mindset? And so I think one kind of imperative is the ability to actually teach hands-on digital skills to employees who may not have a technical background, with the ability that it's actually, one, going to help with the automation journey and make that quicker, but two, it's actually going to equip them with some of the tools they need to develop that analytical thinking and what will actually make them more beneficial in the future, both in the perspective of tools they may have at their fingertips to help solve problems, but also the ability to identify additional things that they could be doing as a company. I think the other interesting thing, though, and that's maybe the more pragmatic, tactical aspect, but I think the kind of bigger thing, interesting thing that we're seeing is companies are formulating upskilling programs around, quote, digital. Digital doesn't necessarily mean just how do I code a bot hands-on. That's part of it, and I personally think it's important, or is something I live and breathe every day. But we're also seeing the softer side of this get as prioritized, and often a digital upskilling program will have a technology track to it, and it's also going to have a softer skill side to this. So how do I teach agile? How do I teach design thinking, product management? These are skills that maybe in the high tech industry have been fairly well accepted, but if I were to go into, say, the banking or insurance space, they're still emerging skills, and something that people have to learn kind of alongside that. And I think to the extent companies are actually focusing on kind of a holistic approach to that kind of blends those two together, we think it's going to be really powerful, setting people up for those roles that are emerging in the future.
And it's not just aspirational either, right? If you look at the World Economic Forum paper, 66% of employers surveyed said that they expect to get a return on investment within 1 year, right, of that upskilling program. So is it the case that technology is just there's enough options for upskilling, reskilling platforms, and the content is there, and like, are we at the perfect storm where it's just easier to get that return so quickly?
I think we're at the perfect storm for the opportunity to get that return. I think we dig into this a little bit further, both with the World Economic Forum data and some augmented with some of the data that comes out of our annual CEO survey from a PwC perspective. one of the interesting findings is most companies, I think the stat coming out of our CEO survey is only 18% of CEOs felt that their company had made any progress on upskilling initiatives, which is a pretty low stat when you think about it. And then it's kind of complemented with the fact that they also feel that they can't, from a cost containment and profitability perspective, they can't transform quick enough. So, the demand is there, the opportunity is there. I think there are still barriers to get there. I think one is having the right focus that brings together the right stakeholders from an upskilling perspective. When I say stakeholders, I think learning has always been thought about as a HR, chief learning officer, chief HR officer type function in an organization. And this really, I think, needs stronger partnership from the business and from business units to actually take charge of that from a barriers perspective, to actually get the right sponsorship behind it. I think getting the right, communications out about what this actually means and making people feel comfortable with it. At PwC, one of the things that we made a big deal about was making employees feel like, we're going to leave no person behind. If you want to go through this upskilling journey, we will support you in this. We will provide the training, the tools, everything that will make you valuable at this. It's, for us, it wasn't purely for altruistic purposes. It was also because we wanted our employees to be a weapon in our own transformation. And we felt that was critical, but we had to be kind of honest with our employee base around, this will benefit you, this will benefit us. And whether you're an employee at PwC for the long term or whether you're going to get a job somewhere else, we're going to equip you with the right skills in order to do that. So we found that very critical. I think that the third barrier is making sure the infrastructure for the company is set up appropriately to take advantage of this. And this may dovetail into probably some other topics we can get into, but I think the other interesting piece as we get into the topic of digital upskilling is resistance at trying to make tools available to the employee set. I think a lot of our clients still very much have a mindset of IT builds things, the business provides requirements. And that's kind of an old school cultural mindset that, when you get into saying, okay, can an operations analyst start using an RPA tool or a data wrangling tool or a data visualization tool, and you start to get into the 50 reasons why that can't happen. It's going to create undue operational risk, technology risk. It's going to be the next generation of spreadsheets. There's lots of resistance factors that are up there. I think there's answers to most of those in terms of best practices and how we see companies dealing with this. But I do think that is creating a barrier.
Yeah, I'm going to dovetail on that one because we saw the same thing. So we didn't find a problem getting people upskilled. I mean, candidly, people would jump on Udemy or Coursera or one of the many different, other platforms there are to get upskilled. But to me, the only thing worse than upskilling somebody was upskilling someone and not then giving them the tools to actually use those skills. Because then all you're doing is frustrating them, right? Because now they can go home on their laptop, they can code out all they want, they can figure out how to automate some process, and they come back to work and they can't do any of it, which is almost a worse scenario from a employee buy-in, if you will. And so for me, not that upskilling is not important, it absolutely is. But to Kevin's point, if it's not tied to that governance, and if you don't know how to integrate that into the broader ecosystem that you have, you're kind of running with scissors a little bit. So what we found, and it's not something I'm personally passionate about, but it's something I think is really important, is the governance aspect of RPA. So if I were to take a tool and just say, hey, go nuts, the reality is people can do some pretty damaging things with it. And so because they can, there's a risk aversion to unleashing the people to basically use those tool sets. And even on the novice user side, there's a little bit of a fear factor of, well, I don't know how much I want to do with this because I don't want to break anything, right? So they tend to stay a little bit more in their safe zone. And so I think this is no different than any other professional kind of skill set you have, in the sense of, once you understand the actual structure behind it and you understand kind of where you're moving with it, you can get more comfortable with it, and you can basically have that confidence to allow you to run a little faster. So for us, it was important to do that both for the airmen themselves that we're going to code out, and then also for the institution that was going to basically allow them to do that. And so, we put, I've kind of lost count. I think it's probably 200-300 people through just our most recent citizen developer kind of efforts over the last 6-8 months. And we didn't just hand them a license. We actually brought them in, did some training, walked them through the process for engineering stuff, partnered with some CPI folks to think through what they're actually trying to automate, get a little structured about it, understand the risk that they're incurring, all that kind of stuff. And what that did is it allowed them to run a little bit faster because it built the confidence as they did it. And then from an organizational side, what we saw was one, obviously, it gives us some controls in that process, but it also allows us to get after some pain points that in isolation may not warrant getting after, in the sense of like, I can automate, an hour, 30 minutes of work out of my personal day, but that may not be worth it for the institution just to save Taylor Heron 30 minutes, right? But if I can take 30 minutes I save and I can scale that and save, 20,000 people 30 minutes, well, suddenly it's a whole different value proposition, right? And that individual, what we found, wasn't postured to go scale their particular bots or whatever their automation was that they were working on for the whole Air Force or for the whole organization. But layering in some level of ecosystem, we use Orchestrator to do it, but basically have an orchestration kind of capability to be able to manage that deployment and then manage the sustainability of those deployments, things like that, allowed us to really get after some lower end use cases that in isolation wouldn't have made sense, but at an enterprise level, absolutely did.
Yeah,
So
maybe,
please,
Kevin. Just to jump on there real quick, Bingo highlights a really important point here, which, we're probably going to almost do a full circle back to the benefits case and some of the change management aspects to this. One of our important factors we found in our own internal implementation of a kind of full citizen-led model was this aspect of creating a collaboration, crowdsourcing, whatever you want to call it, type movement for scaling. And it did two different things. One, I think the more immediate thing, which Bingo rightly highlighted, was the ability to get ROI even out of the smallest automations, right? Half an hour by itself isn't a lot. Half an hour times 100 or times 1,000 starts to add up to real numbers, and we found that was important. The second thing that it actually did was it created a safer environment, because you didn't have everyone reinventing the wheel and potentially creating dangerous assets. We created a collaboration platform that allowed users kind of akin to an Apple App Store to upload assets to and then once those assets are available on the platform for others to download it. By doing that, one, it kind of brings out the best ideas of everyone. It kind of helps people contribute to creating that, but also make sure that you're kind of getting a best in breed. But the second really important part to that, by having that collaboration, it made the governance easier. It gave, the message to our technology folks was, your role is changing, right? Your job isn't to build things for everyone. Your job is to monitor and oversee things that people are building and to provide guidance, and we'll give you, help, quote, run the platform to make this work. But then the second really interesting thing it did was create intelligence around the organization and actually feed ideas into what some of the bigger end-to-end digitization type opportunities are out there by looking at all the little stuff that's there. And so, at least for us, I think part of getting over that cultural hump was, one, proving that there's a benefits case and there's real benefit to get out of this in the immediate, but actually for an IT professional doing their job, this is kind of feeding the beast and giving them all sorts of opportunities that will actually allow them to focus their efforts at the bigger stuff. And I think, at least as we're looking at our clients and seeing this, that's what, I think it's what's getting IT over the hump of, this is actually not a threat to me. This is actually going to make my job as a technology professional more beneficial, because I get to focus on the most complex, most challenging problems, and I don't have to sweat all the little stuff that usually takes up a good portion of my time.
And Kevin, I want to jump on that, because that was really important for us too. So what we found is that a traditional model was end users highlight issue. A lot of those issues get highlighted, prioritized in some rack and stack, and then you obviously funding's applied. There's some cut line. You go and get after a handful of them. And that, it's a traditional process. It's fine. But the challenge with that is the things that got funded and supported, the difference between that and the things that didn't, really is the difference between how well is this an articulated argument, how much stuff you put behind it, which is an okay approach. What we found was a much better approach was when we allowed the system developers to actually code their own stuff. what we realized was that there was a massive difference between something someone would highlight as, hey, this could be nice, and something that they're willing to actually roll up their sleeves till 2 in the morning and code out their own solution to it. If it's important enough for people to try and fix on their own, to me, that was a really good warning sign that, like, hey, maybe there's actually something here. And then to your point, having that app store-ish kind of capability, however you want to deploy it, to allow folks to effectively grade each other's homework and say, it's a really great thing for Taylor, and Taylor used it, but no one cares about it but Taylor, so that's interesting, Taylor, do your own thing. Or, hey, here's something Kevin coded out, and by the way, there's 1,000 people that rely on this thing that love it, right? And then we're able to take our IT workforce and apply them back towards hardening those things that we think, basically the market has shown has the most, validity in the organization. And so that's how kind of we went after it. And then the other thing it told me, and this is kind of the future a bit, is, my end state candidly is never RPA. From my perspective, RPA allows me to look across multiple work streams, figure out what those common integrations are that might not have been so obvious to me, where those breakpoints are. But eventually, once you've identified those, at some point you can roll back in and do actual system integration, right? And you can say, here's 4 systems that apparently need to talk to each other that don't. Why don't we actually just build that functionality together? And so we look at that as a bit of an indicator for us to, allow the system developer kind of workload or, work streams to reveal those broader system integrations we need to work, and ultimately work us out of that dependency on those specific bots.
That's great. So I want to try and do my best to pull out a couple of themes here from the conversation that I think are really important that have been touched on. One was the need for COEs that perhaps are used to that classic top-down implementation methodology to evolve as well and support that bottoms-up movement, right? And that requires some new skills, probably even some new perspectives. As I think, Kevin, like you said, you're going from just being in that gather requirements, deliver, and then Taylor and the rack and stack, right? Those traps that we fall into where the process actually influences the outcome rather than the items themselves, right? Being able to speak for themselves. So we've got to change the way that our IT organizations are functioning, thinking, and then there's a complementary offset change from the business organizations to take more of that on as well and be participatory in that bottoms up activity. So neither one is the full solution. You need that top down for governance. You need it for some of the larger programs, but that bottoms up, that citizen led or that human first approach complementing is going to provide more value. And so you get this 1 + 1 = 3 type of outcome. Excellent. I want to take a question or two from the audience. And Taylor, maybe we go to you for the first one. Can you share a practical example of an RPA application and guide us through it and describe the benefits?
Sure. So I'll walk through the personnel one. Let me flip a little bit to something a little more operational. So for us, we have a massive fleet of aircraft, as you would imagine. In order to keep those things moving and doing all the great things you have to do, you have to take them and basically maintain them. Some of that maintenance is kind of, just like you do with your car, just kind of routine maintenance. And some of it is like depot level, like tear the whole thing apart, and then put it all back together kind of maintenance. So if you can imagine, for those very, very expensive aircraft, there's a handful of them that are never in operation because they're out of the cycle and they're basically going through that depot maintenance kind of process. So that process for us, if we get efficiencies out of it, it allows us to basically shift more of our inventory into the operational fleet versus, basically being stuck over in the maintenance side of the house. And so an aircraft will come into that world and they'll be torn apart. And as they're walking through, there's basically a weekly review that all the people come together and there's like, here's the things we saw, and here's kind of the next step. And that resets every week. Well, I mean, that process has historically been, we call it walk the wall, because they literally print, this is scary, but they print like PowerPoint up on the wall and they're like, here's all the different pieces. And, you imagine a bunch of people working on this problem, put it all up there, and then once a week, they're like, okay, here's the whole thing. Let's walk this through, and like, what decisions do we need to make and where do we need to go? I don't even want to go through the details of how much manpower that is, but if you could imagine manpower of just enabling the decisions there so you can kind of walk through that more smartly. Well, this wasn't a enterprise down thou shalt go fix this. This was a guy that had to go print PowerPoint slides and put all this stuff up. They're just mad. And he's like, I could automate this stuff. Why don't I? So he took citizen developer stuff. So he used UiPath in this case, basically coded it out, worked the automations, and he took us from that, once a week snapshot, super laborious process to something that effectively you hit the button, you're there, which allowed us to obviously save them time so they can spend more time, actually maintaining stuff, but it also allowed us to avoid those breaks in work. So you didn't have to pause every week. So basically, as soon as you identify a problem, you start working on it. So that effort alone allowed us to, return aircraft back to the fleet. In some cases up to a month earlier than they otherwise would have. And over the aggregate, that then becomes well, if I got more aircraft in the fleet that are actually capable of flying today if I needed them to, then I actually need less aircraft overall in order to, so I don't have to have so many stuck in the maintenance piece of it. So it's just a practical example of where we're going. And that was a citizen-led, some airmen excited about it, let's go work it. It also means that now I have the ability to maintain aircraft. So if we're in active combat and they start to get attrited more often or they get damaged or whatever, it takes less time to get them into the maintenance realm and then get back out of the maintenance realm and back on the flight line where we can use them.
Awesome, thank you. Kevin, one for you. How do you scale IT support for RPA and how do you ensure governance?
Sure, it's a great question. So, I guess two thoughts that are out there. I'm actually going to take this in kind of reverse order of the question. I think one, in terms of kind of enabling governance, I think part of the challenge and something we at PwC are trying to meet in the market is it's not just about the actual digital tools like the UiPath or getting into some of the other categories around data. It's also about the infrastructure that you can put around it. And so I gave that example of an internal automation app store, having a platform and having the infrastructure around that to give you the workflow that allows people to develop things, put them through a basic review process. You can to customize the review process as needed, and then the ability to easily distribute and have those run, and then the ability to have monitoring and oversight are important aspects. It's something I know we invested a lot with our partners at UiPath working on to make sure that worked internally as we were rolling this out to 50,000 US employees, and it can work at scale if you get the right software platforms and infrastructure that surround this. The second part, which is a challenge, and I view this as a good problem to have, but it is a challenge. As you do scale the citizen model, you do build up some interesting support questions. And there's really two different challenges to take on. One is a governance throughput challenge. As we have more citizens building bots, we make every bot go through a formal review process to make sure kind of basic technology hygiene is being followed. People aren't hard coding entitlements or putting PII data hard coded or doing other things into that. That is a lengthy process, and as more people are developing this, it does build backlogs. We're trying to address that through not just hiring more people, but actually starting to figure out how can we automate governance. And it kind of goes back to the infrastructure question that I laid out, and thinking about what does your governance infrastructure look like. So the ability to the extent we can get smarter around what to look for, the person who's actually doing that oversight from an IT perspective, it doesn't become a manual, laborious process for them. The second challenge, which I think is going to be the next frontier as we look at the citizen-led model, is starting to think through this question of asset ownership long-term. And I think when we rolled out the citizen model, we took the kind of approach of buyer beware, right? If you build a bot, it's on you to support it as the author of that bot. Even if it gets distributed, you're still essentially the author and the owner, so people can come to you as questions. And it was our way of kind of distributing out the model. That's great as a first-generation approach to that. As automations are developed that become more critical parts of business processes, as people start to leave the company and move on to other career opportunities, you're obviously creating issues where someone could build something that gets embedded into a critical business process and then they're no longer here. That creates business risk. And so the second challenge from a scaling perspective is starting to think through, okay, at what point do you actually need to transfer something that is becoming critical into a more formal IT ownership role? And so it's not just a question of IT reviews, approves, and kind of looks at intelligence, but it may be, kind of going full circle back to the COE model I talked about at the beginning. What assets do need to be owned by the center because they have become important and critical enough, and how do you actually manage that give and take on a day-to-day basis?
Makes sense. We're coming in on time here, so I have one final thought, one final question for each of you, and that's if you could go back in time before you started your RPA journey in your respective organizations, what advice would you give yourself? Kevin, do you want to start with you? What brief?
I was hoping Vigo would start, but I think, and maybe this kind of sums up this entire discussion, is really think about the people aspects and the change management exercise that you're going to go through the organization. I think too often, especially in the early days, the discussion devolved into a kind of, is it the right technology, and what I like to call kind of like the technology bake-off type discussion, like should I be using RPA to do this? Should I be having IT build an API? Should I be doing that, this and that? And it got too much into a sort of techie conversation, and I think that was ignoring the challenges that we're dealing with now around how do you actually take an entire organization on this journey, from an upskilling perspective, from an operating model perspective, from everything else.
Awesome. I was gonna say go faster. That's what I would have told myself. Yeah. I think the one thing that I probably overlooked was the value of the process reengineering work. So, for me, I was like, oh, this is easy. Here's a 12-step process, and steps 7 through 8 are horrible. So just automate that thing, you'd be good, right? And that's interesting, but I think you run a risk doing that, of just hardening in very human-centric processes. So our human-centric model is built with all of our, human limitations. And so that 12-step model may work great for a person doing it. And yes, the machine can speed it up, but you unlock a whole different level of potential if you were to just take a step back and say, this particular outcome I want to get, is there another way to get there? If I were able to pull the power of machines, and humans together to do this. And you may find it's not a 12-step process, it may be a 4-step process or a 37-step process or whatever, right? And so I think for us, we rushed a little bit, and I don't regret it, but here you go, here's license, go nuts, so we can kind of learn as we do it. But I think what we've learned is that pulling people in, doing some of that problem deconstruction up front, doing that deliberate process mapping, a little bit of that process reengineering work where it makes sense, to make sure that whatever we're hard baking in with RPA, we're doing it in a way that's going to maximize the ROI and not just, adopt the limitations of an old process, if that makes sense.
Perfect sense. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I always enjoy these conversations, and this has been incredible. So thank you for coming on. And we do have a handout in the chat for anyone watching that wants to learn a little bit more about some of the topics discussed here.
Awesome. Appreciate your time. Thanks, Brandon.
Yep. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you. Brian, you might be on mute.
Brian, you're on mute.
My apologies. I hope you enjoyed that session as much as I did. My apologies for being muted just then. Please do catch up with Brandon, Taylor, and Kevin on social media following this event, and reach out to them with any queries or questions you may not have had the opportunity to answer during that time. Our next session begins at the top of the hour, 10 o'clock, for Armand and Jelly, who will be looking at how CFOs can best leverage intelligent automation. So we'll see you back sharp at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much for joining us for the opening session, and see you at 10 o'clock. Take care.